Okay, everybody, we're live on Facebook now as well. So let me introduce myself. My name is Daryl Boness, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Marine Mammal Science. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Editors Select Seminar Series. This is the third seminar in our series. This series of presentations arise from recent papers published in Marine Mammal Science or on Early View in Marine Mammal Science, and they're selected to be considered for a seminar by the journal's board of editors. Just to give you a few things about the seminar tonight, just so everyone knows, use the Q&A for submitting questions rather than chat. The seminar is being recorded and it'll be posted on Society's YouTube. And we also have, if you're coming in late, we have a limited number of slots on Zoom, so you may have to move over to Facebook if you get a message that Zoom is filled up. So tonight, this presentation will be focusing on what probably most people would admit is the most majestic of all marine mammals, although having worked on pinnipeds, I might want to argue a little bit, but and that's the blue whales. And blue whales are these incredible animals that can reach up to 120 feet, 33 meters in length, and weigh up to an amazing 330,000 pounds or 165 tons. Now, I'd have had a great deal of difficulty working with an animal like that if I had to capture it and do things. So really looking forward to this talk tonight. Tonight's speaker will be Dr. Trevor Branch. Dr. Branch has spent much time studying this species as well as others. And in fact, he's published 15 papers to this point on blue whales. And in talking with him a little bit earlier, I understand he could talk a lot more than an hour about blue whale stuff. So stay tuned. Dr. Branch obtained his bachelor's and master's degree at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and he received his PhD in 2004 from the University of Washington in Seattle. He's currently the Richard C. and Lois M. Worthington Endowed Professor in Fisheries Management in the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences at the University of Washington. Tonight, Dr. Branch will be talking to us about sex ratios in blue whales from conception onward. He has a co-author on the paper on which his talk is based. His co-author is Dr. Cole Monahan. Dr. Branch's paper is published in the January issue that just came out, Marine Mammal Science. And for those of you who may not have access to papers in Marine Mammal Science, the paper will be on open access for the next 2 weeks. So you'll have free access to it if you want to download it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Branch to tell us about sex ratios in blue whales. Trevor?
Good evening, everybody here on the west coast of the US. Good morning to those in Australia, and who knows what time it is elsewhere in the world. I appreciate this chance to talk about my favorite animal in the whole world, blue whales. They may not be the most dynamic and acrobatic of all the whale species, but they're the biggest, and we'll give them that. Let me just share my screen, and hopefully that comes through to everybody. Hopefully everybody can see that. I got started in this on this topic just out of curiosity, and I think it's important to realize that a lot of scientific questions start off like that. You don't sometimes know what is going to be interesting to you until you start digging into something, and as you dig in, it may spark some curiosity in you. You might find some patterns. You might find something you can't explain, and that's what happened to me here. And as I started digging in, I realized that really nobody had looked into this kind of topic for whales in general and blue whales in specific. And as I dug into it, I realized there was a super rich theoretical literature in ecology in general that I could tap and try and answer questions on using the blue whale data as my data set. So the first thing to realize when you're talking about sex ratios, and what I mean by sex ratio is simply the proportion of one sex compared to the other sex. So throughout this talk, I'm going to, as a shorthand, use the proportion of males in the population. I could equally, of course, use the proportion of females in the population. So when I talk about the sex ratio being 50%, it's going to be 50% males, and of course, 100% minus that of females. And the theory on this goes back to the 1930s, when for the first time, scientists really started to think about why is it that most mammals have a 50-50 sex ratio, 1-to-1 sex ratio. And the reasoning is that if there is some kind of mutation or genetic favoritism towards one sex over the other sex, then as that passed through the generations, one sex would become more common than the other sex. But this means that the more common sex is going to produce fewer offspring on average than the rare sex, because there simply is going to only be enough males and females around for each female to produce a certain number of offspring. And so if there are too many males, the males are going to produce fewer offspring on average than the females, and vice versa. And so there's going to be a self-correcting tendency for males and females to be at about the same sex ratio, about the same proportion in any population. And there's some math behind it, but the logic is kind of irrefutable. So that holds for mammals in general. But of course, everybody knows that there are lots of species where this does not hold at all. There are extraordinary sex ratios present in lots of species that we see commonly in everyday life. And a classic example of this is honeybees. That the honeybee colony is comprised almost entirely of female workers. And of course, the queen is female too. And with just a sprinkling of male drones, just enough to fertilize the eggs and produce a new crop of queen bees that can go out and start their own colonies. And the same is true of ants and termites and many other wasp species. And there are lots of insect species where this is the case, where almost all of the individuals in the population are female, with just a smattering of males. And there's an entire theoretical basis for this and why this makes sense, but it really comes down to the fact that all of those workers in a colony share all of their genes with the queen, right? So the queen has got genes from a male and a female parent, but the offspring just have half of the genes that the queen has. It's what's called haplodiploid. So those workers only have half the genes, but all of the genes they have are shared with the queen. So that if the queen successfully reproduces and starts other colonies and produces more offspring, all of those workers get their exact genes reproduced through the generations. And so this is how it can totally make sense for all those workers to be not sexually able to reproduce, but to keep on working hard to ensure the genes of the colony are passed on to the next generation. But mammals don't work like that. Mammals always have two parents, and you have half your genes from one parent, half the genes from the other parent. And so if the sex ratio goes out of kilter, it doesn't make sense for it to continue that way. It will self-correct. So what about humans? What's the sex ratio in humans? Well, it turns out that at birth, it's just slightly male biased. So there's just a slightly bigger chance of having a son than having a daughter. So why would this be? If I've told you the theory says the sex ratio for mammals should be 50-50, why is it that in humans it's slightly male biased? And the answer is that, well, males are prone to doing riskier things, and males are also prone to dying from disease a bit more often. And in general, what happens is that males die off a little bit more than females do in all human populations. And the net effect of this is that by the time you get to reproductive age and you start having kids of your own, the sex ratio in most human populations is about 50-50. And in that light, it makes total sense that you'd have more sons than daughters born, just enough to offset that increased chance of your sons dying before they get to the age when they can have children of their own. So in that sense, it all makes sense. What you're really talking about when you say there's an expected 1-to-1 or 50-50 sex ratio is that by the time you get to reproductive age, males and females should be about the same proportions in the population. Now, having said that, there are a wide variety of other hypotheses. And one of the most common, one of the most prevalent of these is called the Trevor-Willard hypothesis for sex ratios. And this holds that in any population where one sex might do better if it was given lots of resources. So it's kind of hard to think about this theoretically, but think of an elephant seal population. So with elephant seals, the males command these large harems of females. And so one male could have lots and lots of offspring, but each female can only have one pup, all right? But if you were able to have a male offspring and give it lots of food and provision it and make sure it grows enormous to a large size, it will be able to fight off all the other males and command its own harem. But if you are not able to give your male offspring lots of food and energy, and it grows up small, it's not going to be able to defeat all the other males, and it's not going to reproduce at all. And so the Trevor-Willard hypothesis says that if environmental conditions are good, then mothers should tend to have more sons if the sons have an outsized reproductive possibility. And they should ensure their sons grow up nice and big and they can command their own harems and produce lots of offspring of their own. But if environmental conditions are bad, the last thing you want to do is have a son that you can't feed up and have it get big. You want to have a daughter because every female elephant seal is going to have one pup a year, or maybe it's one pup every 2 years. I'm not quite sure. I'm sure the people who work on elephant seals can tell me what the correct reproductive allocation is. So when conditions are good, you invest in the sex that's going to produce lots of offspring. When conditions are bad, you invest in the sex that will at least have one offspring per year. Okay, so that's the Trevor-Willard hypothesis for sex ratios. But, you know, here's the quote I really like. It says, because theory predicts equal production of the two sexes, any deviation from equality invites interpretation and prods the imagination of theoreticians. And what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to look at sex ratios for blue whales in a whole bunch of different ways, looking for when and where and why they deviate from equality. I really like the background picture. This is looks like a two-headed spotted hyena pup from Kruger National Park that I took when I was there in the before times, before COVID. And the cool thing about hyenas is you cannot tell what sex they are because their outside appearance looks almost identical between the two sexes. But the females are in charge, so they're a matriarchy. So having said all this, how is it that sex ratios are even determined at birth? And there are many, many, many theories about this. I could spend an hour just talking about all the theories, almost none of which hold up in reality. It could be that females alter the sperm passage so that male sperm end up being selected or disfavored even before insemination. It could be that in utero, there is just higher mortality of one sex, so that by the time they're born, the sex ratio differs. There could be some effect of when insemination occurs relative to the estrus cycle and hormone levels and so on. But the key thing is that none of these hypotheses have ever resulted in a working way of selecting for one sex over the other in livestock on farms. Think about it, if you're a farmer, what you really want to do most of the time is produce lots of females, right? You want to produce females because they're going to in turn produce lots of offspring themselves, and your farm can grow much faster. Most often you just need a few males, enough to hire out as your prized bull that goes and inseminates all the females in the area. But what you really want is lots of females. But there's no easy way, natural way, I should say, of timing insemination or changing hormone levels or anything like that to ensure that the sex ratios changed much from about 50-50. So what I'm going to try and do in this talk is settle on some of the things we can answer for whale populations when looking at the differences between sexes that impact sex ratios. And one of the things we can look at is whether the two sexes have different migration pathways and patterns. And we see this for some species. We know that humpback whales have sex-specific migration patterns, and you can go at different times of their migration to breeding grounds and different places, and you can find places where almost all the individuals are female, apparently because they need some place to be away from males looking for the mating season. They just want to have some relaxation. We can ask questions also about survival rates. Do males survive at higher rates than females, or vice versa? We can detect within sex ratio analysis whether one species, one sex, grows faster than another one, the somatic growth rate, how big the individuals get. And we can ask whether there's any management issue regarding whether human exploitation or other kinds of impacts are more severe on one sex versus the other. When whaling happened, was it more severe on females or males? So what I plan to do in this talk is to do a careful examination of sex ratios across age and length, day of the year and area and year, hoping it will reveal much about the growth, movements, behavior, and human impacts on, in this case, blue whales. So how can I do this? I mean, those of you who know me well know that I am more or less a fake marine mammal scientist. I'm a theoretical ecologist. I'm a model. I'm a population model. I sit on my computer and I look at data, I analyze data, I build models, I predict things, I look for patterns, I try and synthesize all the data I can find about something, and then come to some idea what's happening, find patterns, prove or disprove theories. I don't do a whole lot of going out into the field and sampling whales myself. All right, so it's not like I can go out and sample 1,000 blue whales or 10,000 blue whales and get good data on their sex ratios. That would also be pretty much impossible, since there are only maybe 10 to 25,000 blue whales left in the world after whaling happened. So what happened with blue whales? Well, the data we get come from modern whaling. Before the period of modern whaling, which for blue whales really started in the late 1800s, but took hold in the early 1900s, is when they switched over from the Moby Dick type whalers that were going after sperm whales and right whales and humpback whales that are easy to catch, they're slow moving, and if you catch one, they don't sink. They're the right whales. That's where the name comes from. And modern whaling got around some of the problems of the sailing boats not being able to keep up with the fast swimming fin whales and blue whales and sei whales and minke whales. They had a variety of technological modifications that enabled them to go and target whales wherever they were, and no matter how fast they swam, and no matter if they sank or if they floated when they were killed. And one of these modifications is the stern slipway. So here you can see an opening at the back of the vessel where you could haul a whale up to process it on the back. So this is a factory vessel, the Aleut, a Soviet factory vessel. And next to it over here is one of a large fleet of catcher vessels. Each of these catcher vessels had an explosive tipped harpoon on the back, air pumps to keep the whales afloat once they were caught, and they were operated by steam or diesel, so they could go as fast as the whales could. And in fact, this Soviet fleet, the Aleut and other big Soviet fleets, would operate in a way that was almost guaranteed to find as many whales as possible and converge on them. They would set out all their catcher vessels in a line of 15 to 24 vessels, each about 10 miles apart, and they would sweep through the ocean in this long line. And if any of those boats found an aggregation of whales, they'd get on the radio and call all the other boats in to catch them all. And then they would bring them all back, they'd haul them all back, tow them behind them to the processor, the factory ship, and process them on board. This became very efficient. And what you can see when you look at the progression of commercial whaling, this modern whaling over time, was at the start there was only whaling up in the North Atlantic, mostly Norway and Iceland. And then in the early 1900s, 1904, they started whaling at South Georgia and the South Shetlands. And by the 1920s, they developed this pelagic open ocean whaling where they could go anywhere they wanted to and process the whales anywhere that they could find them. That's World War II. All the boats got sank during World War II. And by the late 1950s, 1960s, the whalers spread out throughout all the oceans, mostly through illegal Soviet whaling that was catching whales irrespective of the species. That was, some of the species were banned, irrespective of banned areas. And now there's only minke whaling in the Antarctic, which has stopped last year, and the occasional whaling off Japan, off Alaska and Iceland. So that's the progression of this modern whaling over time. And what you see when you look at the whaling data over time is a sequential depletion from the most profitable species to the least profitable species. So initially they targeted, this is data from the Southern Hemisphere, and what you see is that initially they targeted humpback whales. When those declined, they moved to the most valuable remaining species, blue whales, which are a bit harder to catch. When blue whales declined, they moved to fin whales, to sperm whales. When all of those were declining, they moved to sei whales, which are smaller still. And when the sei whales declined, they moved to minke whales, which comprise most of the whales that are currently caught in the world today. I should point out a couple features here. There was a dip in catches in World War I, and there was a big dip in catches in World War II. All of the whaling boats, including the factory boats, the catcher boats, were all requisitioned for the war efforts, and almost all of them were sank. And the whaling fleets were rebuilt very quickly, I should say, after World War II, and rapidly resumed their catching of whales. This is how many whales are caught since the moratorium on commercial whaling. It's a very small number of minke whales compared to the 1970s and early 80s. So this is where we are now. There are no humpback bluefin, very few fin whale catchers, very, very few sperm whale catchers, and no sei whale catchers. So we have data from all of these catchers in the IWC whaling database. And these data comprise the species, the latitude, the longitude, the day, month, and year that whale was caught, the length of the whale, the sex of the whale, the pregnancy status of the whale, and the length and sex of any fetus that they uncovered during the flensing operation. And these data cover most of the catches of most species in the 20th century. And for some species like bluefin, sei, and minke whales, these data are nearly complete. It's a near census for blue whales of what used to be in the ocean before whaling started. There used to be, just in the Antarctic alone, 239,000 blue whales, of which now there are only perhaps a couple thousand left. Whaling took almost all of those. But for the purpose of this study on sex ratios, we have a near complete database of sex ratios that we can look at by length, by day, by location, by month, by year, by region. We can even look at the prenatal data in utero and ask what sex ratios are like at different lengths in utero before they were born. I must say, it makes me feel a little queasy to think about that, but these are data we don't have for many other species. So this is where my data comes from for blue whales. Each of these dots is one catch of a blue whale somewhere in the world. And I've divided them into the groupings that I think are the most important for blue whales. There are the biggest of them all, the biggest of the subspecies of the Antarctic blue whales, all these blue dots, once the most numerous of all the populations, now not the most numerous of all the populations because of whaling. There are Chilean or Southeast Pacific blue whales. There are two populations in the North Pacific, which I've grouped together, and a population or two in the North Atlantic. North Pacific and North Atlantic are considered to be the same subspecies, which seems really weird to me because they're completely geographically separated. And I'm sure at some point the DNA will come back and be conclusive that they should be separated out. And then there's the most enigmatic of them all, which is the pygmy blue whale subspecies, which primarily occur in the Indian Ocean with a smattering off New Zealand and in the Southwest Pacific. And these are the most enigmatic because we know there are at least 5 separate populations that occur in the Indian Ocean. But for the moment, because they're all similar sizes, I'm going to group all those populations together. So we have our grouping, my regions I'm going to look at the analyses for. And the first question I want to ask is there any pattern over time? The thing we worry about here is, did whalers catch all of the big females such that there were no females left in the population? So if we look at the catches of, these are what I'm going to call them adult, they're sort of postnatal, they're mostly whales above 70 feet, which is the legal whaling limit. And what you worry about, you might see here, is that the females are becoming less and less common over time because the whalers are targeting the bigger individuals. In each of these plots, what I'm showing is the sex ratio, and a dot that is blue is a dot that is statistically significantly different from 50-50. So blue dot above the dashed line says there were significantly more males caught in that year, in that region, here the Antarctic, than there were females. And a red dot is a year when significantly more females were caught than males. And the gray dots are ones where it might be above or below, but there weren't enough, the sample size wasn't big enough to conclusively say that males were dominant or females were dominant amongst the catches in those years. And what you see throughout all these regions is that in most cases, males were slightly more common in the catches. And the exception is this one area here, after about 1951, when in almost every year the females were more caught over time than the males. And I don't have a good explanation for this. As I said, my preconception is that the females should be more caught in the earlier years and then be less common because they just were all caught than the males. But what we see is the opposite. What we see is more females being caught later in the time series. And this was a time here when this population had declined down to just 0.15% of original levels. The whalers had caught almost all of them. I don't see similar patterns in the other areas, bearing in mind that the catches in the other areas were at least tenfold lower than in the Antarctic. And so a lot of the data I'm going to talk about now is going to come from the Antarctic, simply because the catches there were in the hundreds of thousands and not in the low thousands to tens of thousands. So that's the annual pattern with this slight unexplained pattern. What if you look at the daily pattern over time? Is there any evidence that males are migrating differently to females? What you might see is if you picked a fixed location, you might see that all the catches at the start of the season are female, and then all the catches in the middle are male, and then all the catches at the end are female again. And what you actually see when you look at fixed locations, these are 3 land stations. The northernmost of these is Saldanha Bay, which is off South Africa, and they were caught there in the winter months in the southern hemisphere. The next southernmost is South Georgia, and then the South Shetlands are considerably further south than South Georgia. All 3 of these had large numbers of blue whales caught at fixed locations from land stations before those pelagic whaling processing vessels could go out and catch them anywhere. And what we see is that at Saldanha Bay, there's a slight prevalence of females in the catch, about 53%. At South Georgia, it's about 50-50. And in the South Shetlands, it's 44% females, almost quite strongly dominated by males. And if we fit fancy models to these data, there are trends that come up that are significantly better than just a straight line over time. But I'm pretty hard pressed to say that this is really that different from a 50-50 sex ratio a constant sex ratio through the course of a season. There's certainly no dramatic pattern of all females at one time and all males at another time, suggesting very strong migration patterns that are sex specific in blue whales. But yeah, if you go and dig in and you fit models to it, you can say that there's a slight linear decline over time, or a sine wave pattern over time, a cyclical pattern over time. But I'm hard pressed to say that this just isn't an artifact of how they whaled and the size of the whales they were able to take. And one example of this is that in the South Shetlands and in South Georgia, at the start of whaling, the land stations and the catcher boats were not big enough to handle the biggest of the whales. And so they much preferred to catch the smaller males because they could be hauled onto land and processed more easily with the tackle and equipment that they had. And so this might explain why the South Shetlands, where most of the whaling was early in the 1910s and early 1920s, has more males in their catches. It may not be a pattern of true migration. It might be a pattern of just the available equipment couldn't handle the big females, and so there was targeting for males. So that's a daily pattern of sex ratios. What do we see when we look over space? So I'm going to move from those fixed land stations to the data that came from the pelagic catches. These were the catches from those big factory ships that could go and catch whales anywhere. So if you look by month, here's October, November, December, January, and February, and March. You can see that, first of all, of course, the whaling boats were further away from the continent at the start of the season and closer in at the end of the season. That's simply a factor of the sea ice retreating over the course of the whaling season. So they moved closer into the continent as the sea ice retreated. And what you see is pretty much everywhere, the slight blue color indicates a slight preference for males in most places. A pretty strong preference down here in South Georgia for males. But there are also pockets where the smoother model, which is called VAST, for those that know anything about it, shows some pockets where there's slight preference for females. And I'm pretty hard pressed to say that there's any particular region that's dominated more by females than by males, or by males and not by females. But the model does suggest that these patterns in pockets of males and females are more than you would expect by random chance. So there's some statistical evidence for non-random sex availability, but in all cases, it's pretty minor. And we can see the same thing when you look by era and space for the same set of data from pelagic catches. And this kind of marries these two things together. In the early period, most places were mostly male catchers. This is before World War II. And after World War II, most places were slightly dominated by females, except for this Ross Sea area, which is strongly male dominated. I don't have an explanation for that. I don't know why the Ross Sea would be like that, but it is. And these patterns do seem quite consistent over time. So now let's pivot and ask a question about how these sex ratio similarities might arise in utero. And I apologize for those of you who are a bit squeamish. You might want to close your eyes for the next 2 slides. But here is what a blue whale looks like when it's just 20 centimeters long. It's not too far after conception. In utero, they can be as big as 7.46 meters long, 24 feet long, and several tons. This is not a grown-up whale. This is a whale fetus just about to be born. And one of the things that have been highlighted about dealing with these fetal data is that it's really hard to sex them when they're tiny. Remember, back then they didn't have a good genetic way of sexing whales. They would simply look at them and say, this looks male, it looks female. And it turns out that the sexual organs look really, really similar when they're at the tiniest length. And it's really hard to tell them apart. And very often the females are misidentified as males, at least for sei whales. So when trying to interpret sex ratios by the length of the fetus, as they grow bigger, they get older in utero, we have to take into account the fact that there might be some misidentification of sexes at the smallest lengths. And so here are the data, and I developed a few models and try to figure out which is the best one that fits these data the best. And the answer is pretty strongly that the one that includes a misidentification term, this bit up here where the model says there's strong evidence of more males in the data, and at these lengths, 69% of all of the fetuses were male, far more than you'd expect from a 50-50 sex ratio. Probably that's because of misidentification of sexes. But there's also something which I did not expect, which is a trend from more males to more females as the fetuses got larger and older, closer to birth. And I don't have any good explanation for this. It's possible that males have higher in utero mortality. I don't see any evidence in the other data that I've looked at that females grow faster than males do. They seem to grow at almost exactly the same pace in utero. I don't see any evidence that mothers carrying female calves would leave the whaling grounds earlier than mothers carrying male calves. So probably the best explanation is a slightly higher mortality in utero for males. But this doesn't jibe with the idea that the sex ratio of postnatal adult blue whales are about 50-50 or slightly male biased. So if it's true that more females are born, then why is it that there are just slightly more males in the population after birth amongst the whaling population? So I don't have a good explanation for that. Now, once they're born, we see quite strong patterns in the lengths of whales that were caught during whaling. And what we see is kind of what you expect. The biggest individuals within each population, remember the Antarctic blue whales are really big, and pygmy blue whales are really, really small. They're only up to about 80 feet. That all of these populations have more females than males at the larger lengths, as you expect. And at intermediate lengths, they unexpectedly for me had more males. There was a big bump in males, and I couldn't quite figure out why that would be the case. And so I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, wait a minute. Both males and females reach some asymptotic length. what happens is, just like in humans, you grow for a time, and then your backbone, your bones start to fuse, and you can't grow anymore. In whales, they stop being able to keep on growing. They reach physical maturity, and that happens at about age 30 or so. So most of the adult whales have stopped growing that you see in the population, which means there might be a large group of males that have all reached physical maturity and stopped growing. So the question is whether I can develop a model that explains these patterns of more females out here and more males out here, and about 50-50 at the smaller lengths. It turned out this is kind of hard. It turns out that we don't have good length at age data. So I couldn't just go and find the length and the age of a whole bunch of whales and fit a model to it. It just doesn't fit very well. We don't have very good data down here at these younger ages over here. So I won't call this the best explanation. I'll just call this a plausible explanation for the Antarctic of lengths of males and lengths of females that fit in with what we know about length at physical maturity, length at sexual maturity, length at birth, and we know that females get bigger than males do at a particular age. So this is plausible, but I could certainly do better if I had better data. But the point is that if you then put these lengths into an age-structured population model of blue whales, you can infer how many Antarctic blue whales there should be at each length before whaling started. So this would be what you'd expect in a pristine population before any whaling hit the population. And something I'd just like to point out is that there were more males at 75 feet long in the population before whaling started than there are total Antarctic blue whales alive now, of any size or any sex in the Antarctic. That even after more than 45 years after whaling ended on them, they still haven't recovered enough to have more whales, more blue whales in the Antarctic than they were 75-foot male Antarctic blue whales before whaling started. It's quite staggering. But what you can see from this, I would say, conceptual model is that there is this pulse of males at around 75 feet, and then there are a much broader range of lots of females at longer lengths, including a point where at about 81 feet, the females become more prevalent than males. And by the really long lengths, there are really no males left to be caught. So you expect almost all of those 95 plus feet blue whales to be female in the Antarctic. And we can put this together and make a prediction about sex ratio by length for the adults. And I didn't try and fit this to the observed data, but you can see you get the same kind of patterns. Each of these lines from my predictive model has a different assumption about how variable the length is at a particular age. So with a high CV, it's more variable. With a low CV, it's less variable at a particular age. And you can see this pretty closely matches the observed data for the Antarctic. There's a bumper here for males, and there's a rapid decline for females over here. Okay, so this is all the stuff that I discovered. I did come to some conclusions. I found that sex ratios for blue whales are pretty close to equality across space and time. I found some evidence for higher male mortality in utero. What I really want to do, and I have a student working on this now, is to look at whether this is true of other whale species too. I found that there are more males at intermediate lengths and more females at longer lengths, and that's purely because of the difference in growth, that females grow larger and faster than males do, and so you find differential sex ratios by length in the adults. I found, bizarrely, that there were more females caught in the later Antarctic catches and not fewer. And I found, I think what my real conclusion is in terms of all those spatial patterns is probably there is some interaction between faster female growth and the whalers at different periods deciding to select for either big individuals or smaller individuals. And so this interaction between size selective whaling and the differential growth rate between males and females. So that's what I have to show you. A lot of this work could not have been done without Cole Monahan, who really started off and found some of these cool patterns at the start, and did all of the spatial modeling that is well beyond my capability. This project was funded by the Southern Ocean Research Program, which collaborates with IWC. The data all come from the International Whaling Commission, courtesy of Cherry Allison. And so my traditional closing slide is this beautiful whale picture from Rodrigo in Chile. And I'm happy to answer any questions people have. Do you want me to stop sharing?
Oh, okay, sorry about that. I was having trouble unmuting myself here.
It's traditional to do that on Zoom meetings.
Yeah. All right. I do see that we have some questions. So maybe we'll, Charles, if you're there, why don't we go ahead and start with questions from the audience?
Sure, lots of good questions. I will go in order for now. So the first one is from Natasha asking, could it be argued that the Antarctic trend in later years is just a reflection that a lot of the males have been caught, and because whales are a long-lived species, there were just more females present than males at the population due to the artificial removal of males? I think you touched on that a little bit, but if you want to revisit.
Yeah, I mean, that could be the case. It's just what I don't understand is why the whalers would have targeted the smaller of the two species. I mean, the two sexes. And there are a lot of things going into this that make it complicated. One of them is that there's a minimum length regulation where they were not allowed to catch whales less than 70 feet legally. There were a lot of shenanigans that went on around that. But you would expect there to be more larger whales caught than smaller whales. But if they were in amongst a part of whales, you'd expect them to target the bigger whales, the females, rather than the smaller whales. So that's why it's kind of puzzling to me. They were also paid more for bigger whales. They got a lot more oil out of the bigger whales than the smaller whales. And some of the females might have, twice as much oil available than the males. So it's really kind of puzzling to me why the males would have been less prevalent than the females. And even in that period in the 1950s and 60s, when the illegal Soviet whaling was happening and they were ignoring the minimum length regulation, with that you would expect that to increase the number of males in the catches, not increase the number of females in the catches. So I'm baffled.
Thank you for that. I guess I'm going to insert a question that I have just for those that are not totally familiar, but could you speak to sort of your sense of the quality of the data and sort of how you talked a little bit about some shenanigans, but I mean, is there great confidence that it's fairly meticulous or fairly trustworthy from all of the places that you pulled from?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is for sex ratios, I believe the sexes as being done properly. There were some really early years in the early 1910s when there definitely are some reports that some of those data might not have been recorded properly. But we don't often have individual data back then anyway. But in the later years, there was no incentive to misreport the sex. There was certainly incentive to misreport where you caught it from, potentially if you were in an illegal area. And the Soviets did a lot of that when they were catching whales north of 40 south. But the data we have now for the Soviets isn't from the original reported data. It's from the reconstructed data from the logbooks where the truth was recorded. So they kept two sets of logbooks. One went to the IWC, and one went to internal consumption to decide how well the whalers were doing. And later on, when they opened up and everything, and they brought to light all of the original data, those original data are now part of the database, and the incorrect data are not in there anymore. So the things that were misreported were lengths. So a lot of the whales caught less than 70 feet were recorded as being exactly 70 feet, and that was done by the inspectors on the boat. I mean, you can imagine sitting on a boat for 5 months with whalers, and if you report that a whale is 69 feet and it's illegal, then the whalers get no money. They get no bounty for catching that whale, and the expedition might get penalized. You can see how they might be tempted to wiggle the tape a little bit and turn a 69-foot whale into a 70-foot whale. I just don't believe that the whalers could distinguish between a 69-foot and a 70-foot whale at sea. But when you look at the data, there's a big spike at 70 feet that makes no sense at all. And that's called whale stretching. If anybody wants to do a project on that, there's some cool stuff that could be done on that.
I'm going to combine a question between Louise Huckstadt and Jay Barlow. They're a little bit commingled. Louise's is, do you know what percentage of the females had calves with them when hunted in Antarctica? And Jay's is, during much of the history of whaling, there were various bans on taking moms with calves. How do you think that might bias your results?
Yeah, both good points. So yes, that was the other thing I meant to bring up, is that the whalers were not allowed to catch whales with calves, but it was very rarely ever prosecuted. And there are almost no infractions ever reported of that happening, which I find it hard to believe. And secondly, most of the calves would have been born in June and weaned before the main Antarctic season started. So they suckle them for about 7 months. So most of the whales were caught in December, January, and later on only February and March. The whaling season for blue whales was only in February, and so there would have been no suckling calves at that time of the year. It could be a factor in November and December, but I don't think it's a factor in January, February, and March. And what was the other? That was the one part. Was the there was a second part of the question. Can you remind me?
Yeah, and I actually approved it, so it disappeared. It was about if just during, the first was how often did it happen? The second was with changes for that, not targeting females with calves, could that have had a role in some of the patterns you saw in the data?
Right, yeah, it could have. The other part of the question was what proportion of them had calves when they were caught?
Right.
And the answer is that's actually not easy to determine. You can't just take the whole database and calculate the proportion that were pregnant, because some expeditions and some years and some boats didn't bother recording those data. So the proportion that are pregnant varies wildly from expedition to expedition in a way that makes me think those data are not recorded completely for all expeditions. So you'd have to find the expeditions where it looks like they were all recorded in order to get proportion pregnant, but it certainly can be pretty high. Certainly can be more than 50%, sometimes as high as 80% in some expeditions in some years. It's likely that they give birth every 2 to 3 years, at least in the Antarctic.
Okay, we're going to pivot briefly we'll get back to sort of biology and behavioral questions in a moment, but this is an analytical approach question from Lauren. Starting with a compliment, this is fascinating work. Thank you for sharing. Lauren's curious about your methodology to estimate many binomial confidence intervals for each unit of length, age, etc. separately. Aside from the spatial mixed effects, did you also explore estimating the sex ratio by the combinations of factors through something like hierarchical or mixed effects models?
Okay, so the first one is for the plots where I show a point with a confidence interval around it, I'm assuming that each of those points is just an independent binomial with a 95% confidence interval around that binomial that depends on the sample size at that length or in that year. So I'm just doing very, very simple stuff there. And of course, you would expect purely by chance that 5% of those intervals will be significantly different from 50-50. And so it's only when, let me just share my screen again. So for example, here's a case here. So here, the 95% confidence intervals around these data points are so narrow that you can't even see them, because each of these data points comes from tens of thousands of whales. But out here, you can see they're broader. And so it wouldn't be right to say that if one of them was significantly different from 50-50, that was meaningful, because I'm doing so many comparisons here, you'd expect 5% of them to be significant. But when you start seeing patterns where a lot of them all in a row are all blue with significant results, or all of them are red in one area with significant results, that tends to be suggestive of a pattern. So then the second question was about whether I did mixed effects or hierarchical models. The spatial smoother VAST incorporates latitude and longitude as covariates and sex as a covariate with a binomial. Actually, it might be a beta binomial. I'm trying to remember. Cole would know to allow some over dispersion. So this does account for spatial smoothing of the effects over time. But the other models I fit, I didn't do any fancy hierarchical models or any mixed effects models looking for the effects of lots of things. And I think someone with great analytical skills might be able to tease apart the joint effects of space, year, day, perhaps expedition, and even nation that was catching them, and length, to tease apart all the different factors that might go into this and get a much more nuanced answer. Here I was really just trying to explore the data and come up with hypotheses that we can test with other whale species. So there's certainly much more sophisticated stuff that can be done than what we did.
Thank you. Daryl,
yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to step in with a question.
Okay.
So Trevor, the sample sizes are just phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's
heartbreaking.
Yeah, I know. Back many years ago, when I was doing work with pinniped sexual selection stuff, and looking at back in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of pinniped biologists asking questions surrounding the Trivers and Willard hypothesis and publishing. And I have to admit, I'm guilty of this myself. You know, data on sex ratio differences with sample sizes of maybe 50, 60 males and females. You know, a really big sample size was 200-300. So how meaningful is it relative to this kind of a data set where, you know, is unheard of in the mammalian world?
Yeah, I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages. So we've talked some about how the data were collected and problems with the data in the database. So that's the disadvantage. The advantage is that we have more than 300,000 adult data points and more than 20,000 fetal data points, which are numbers that for people working on this kind of sex ratio stuff are only approached by people that do research on humans and people that do research on goats, sheep, and cattle. Those are the only comparably large data sets. And so this is it really is a pretty unique opportunity, but you need to really know the foibles of the data to ensure you aren't led astray. And in going through the marine mammal literature, I did come across quite a few papers where, you know, the sample sizes were very small and the sex ratios are very, very skewed, and so they were significant. but you had to worry about, hey, if you went and only looked at 50 individuals and the sex ratio was 30 to 20, was that meaningful, or was it just that one time that somebody went out and found a skewed sex ratio, and the other 500 times that people went out and didn't find a skewed sex ratio, they didn't publish it because it wasn't significant? So there's certainly the temptation to, to worry about. There's certainly something you have to worry about, that there are studies that people looked at sex ratio, found they were 50-50 and didn't publish anything. And if someone found it was significantly different, they published it, that you would have to worry about that sort of file drawer effect of people putting results in the file drawer and closing the drawer and ignoring them.
Thank you. Go ahead, Charles.
The next question, you touched on this a couple of times, but I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about this. It's from Mario, and it gets back to, if there are differences in behaviors that might account for some of the patterns that you saw. Specifically, the question is it possible that females were more evasive to whaling ships and therefore were more difficult to catch at the beginning, but then after they depleted the males, they started to get females, but with more search effort?
That is a great hypothesis. I like that a lot. And we do see that, I don't have any papers I can cite on this, but I've heard people mention and seen in some papers, I can't remember which ones, that when they go do biopsies on whales, that often the males are more easily approached than the females. And so if you go and look at 100 biopsied whales, you might see more males than females. And that's simply because the males are easier to approach. Perhaps they're distracted. Often they're on breeding grounds and the males don't really care what approaches them. And the females are maybe more skittish and annoyed with all the males trying to swarm them. So that's a great idea. So it might be that in the earlier years, if the whalers encountered a big aggregation of males and females, they would just go for whichever one didn't swim away the quickest, and maybe those were male biased. But by the end of whaling, they would just target every single individual they came across, and those are mostly female. And maybe also some interaction with the females accompanied by calves and the Soviet whalers ignoring all of the regulations. So I think that's a fabulous hypothesis.
Another question coming from Barb and Jay. How common is it in mammals to have, it's a broader question, to have a negative trend in males in utero that may be related to the XY chromosome issues?
I cite some other papers in my paper, and I have to say that I'm not sure I really believe the results in a whole bunch of papers that are published. There certainly is some good evidence that males in utero in humans, which is the only real population that's been studied well for this, that males do have higher mortality in utero and more likely to have genetic abnormalities. And that might be indeed because of the XY chromosome, that if you only have a Y chromosome that isn't matched, you'll have a single gene for more things that could lead you into trouble. So it does seem like there's evidence for that. But when I look at the sample sizes of what these studies have, they're all pretty small. And I guess I'm somewhat convinced that it's reasonable, but I'm not thoroughly convinced that the sample sizes are big enough to really say something definitive. And we're going to look at this for other whale species, and because I have a lot of experience in coming up with theories and in finding them disproven when you look at another system, I wouldn't be surprised if this doesn't hold up with other whale species. But if it does, that would be a cool result.
We're getting to the end of the questions. I've got maybe one zinger that I'm going to give you in a minute, but this one is from Joe Marie. This is not specific to the sex ratio topic, but curious about the map of geographic progression of whaling around the world. Noticed there were some catches from the southeastern part of the Philippines. Do you know who that was? When and who was doing it?
Wow, that is a good question. Let me go to my map and think. Oh yeah. I think like literally 1 or 2 whales caught there. And we now know that the Australian pygmy blue whale population migrates around Australia, around the west side of Australia, and goes through to Indonesia and into that region between Indonesia and the Philippines and so on. But there are almost no blue whales caught in that area, even though we now know that's where they go in winter. Oh, sorry. So we know that blue whales go from Australia around to Indonesia and into Malaysia in winter, but there are almost no whales were caught there. There really are just 2 or 3 that were caught there. So each of those red dots represented literally 1 whale, and I think those were Soviet catches. That's my understanding.
Okay, this one's not a question, just a comment from Daniel Palacios. Males and females may have different foraging strategies, possibly driven by different priorities in resource acquisition and advertising. They recently saw some evidence of this with blue whales in Southern California. This could lead to males and females exploiting different habitats, which could explain the patchwork of male and female dominated subareas around Antarctica from the pelagic whale data. So just...
Yeah, that's certainly something to consider. And the reason why I'm a little skeptical about the spatial patterns is that you're fitting the smooth surface to something that's very, very close to 50-50 everywhere. Almost nowhere does it deviate much from 45% or 55%. And so where you see the patterns of red and blue, they're very subtle changes. And so if you think about an area, the model is trying to fit to all of the areas, but some areas are going to have thousands of whales caught. Some areas are going to have hundreds of whales caught. Some areas are only going to have maybe 20 whales caught. And so if only 20 whales were caught in an area, you'd expect there by chance to be maybe 15 males or 15 females out of 20. And so it will look like the sex ratio in that area is dominated by one sex or the other. And the model will do everything it can to fit to those areas and say there's a high proportion of females there or a high proportion of males there. But the uncertainty around that could be quite large. And so if you were to look at the sort of uncertainty around all of that, you might get a different impression about where there really are differences between male-dominated and female-dominated places, except for the Ross Sea, which does seem to be a pretty strong signal.
Okay, so this question is from me. I'm just curious, kind of going meta. You have mentioned multiple times your concerns about sample sizes with sex ratio studies. Daryl has professed to perhaps making broad, sweeping conclusions with relatively smaller sample size.
Professed or confessed?
Yeah. What is the state of marine mammal research and sex ratio studies and our understanding, and where do we need to go, knowing that we cannot replicate hundreds of thousands of samples, but is it a place ripe for greater investigation? And what do we need to do?
I think there certainly is a place for it, but you would really have to be working on a species that's really easily accessible and easy to sex. And you would have to be very wary of believing anything from smaller sample sizes, such that, you know, my advice would be that if you wanted to go and do this, I would say pre-register your studies like they do for medical studies. That if you're planning to do a sex ratio study, you should be required to pre-register what you're going to do and required to publish your results when they come out, regardless if they show anything significant or not. And then maybe you can start to collect enough studies from people that have sample sizes of 50 or 100 from a whole range of different species, and maybe piece together some underlying patterns you might expect to see from those. So I think that there's a role here for someone doing a big synthesis project or meta-analysis that goes around to everybody working on all the bunch of different species and populations and says, well, how much data do you have? And they say, well, I have 20 males and 15 females, and somebody else, I have 95 females and 103 males. And maybe there's a method of piecing all those together to come up with inference that doesn't rely on one study in one place, which is more prone to the small sample size issue.
Definitely answered. That was good. We are done with the questions in this group. If anybody has any and wants to submit them really quickly, or Daryl, if you've got anything follow up and want to close us out.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any more questions specifically along this line. I might just ask you what other things you have on your plate with blue whales or other large whales that you're working on now.
I have so many planned projects. The problem is finding time to finish them all. But luckily, I have a new graduate student, Zoe Rand, who's going to be working on a range of different blue whale projects. So she's the one who's going to be looking at the sex ratios and other whale species. She's also looking at migration from recapture experiments that were done in the 1930s to 1960s on blue whales in the Antarctic, and asking whether Antarctic blue whales are one panmictic population around the Antarctic or possibly multiple populations. I have a project separating all the catches of pygmy blue whales into their individual populations to try and assess status. To figure out the status of a population, you have to know how many were caught and how many there are now. And when the catches were they were all pygmy blue whales, but not which population they belong to, it becomes difficult. So I have a project I'm working on that uses current acoustic song types in different areas to separate out the catches. Then I have a project looking at fetal growth rates and using that to try and separate populations and ask if the North Indian Ocean is separate to the South Indian Ocean for pygmy blue whales. There seems to be a 6-month difference in breeding cycle, and I'm hoping that will give me some enlightenment there. Boy, too many projects to think about. That's just a taste for some of the things I'm looking at.
Great. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for a really nice, thought-provoking seminar. I'm sure we had lots of people who enjoyed, and sounds like we might see some marine mammal science papers down the road from you and your students and colleagues. So Trevor, thank you very much. Before we close out, let me just let everybody who's still around know that we do have our next seminar speaker selected. The seminar will be on the 11th of February. We don't have an exact time yet. And the speaker will be, and I don't know if I'm going to get the last name right, but it's Aaron Dagnes. And Aaron will be talking on reemergence of Guadalupe fur seals in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, the epidemiology of strandings from 2005 to 2016. So we hope to have lots of people tuning in on the 11th of February for our next seminar. With that, I think I will go ahead and close this out. Again, thank you very much, Trevor.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity, Daryl.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you for publishing in Marine Mammal Science.
The best place.
Yes, thank you. Okay, we'll call it quits.